First of all, thank you everyone for coming to our inaugural talk of Fogo Island Arts Lost and Found Agency series. Before we start the talk, we would like to respectfully acknowledge that the territory on which we live and work is the ancestral homeland of the Beothuk, whose culture has been erased forever. We would also like to acknowledge the island of Dahumguk as the unceded traditional territory of the Beothuk and the Mi'kmaq, and we acknowledge Labrador as the traditional and ancestral homeland of the Innu, of Nitassinan, the Inuit of Nunatsiavut, and the Inuit of Nunatukavut. We recognize all First Peoples who are here before us, those who live with us now, and the generations to come. The Lost and Found Agency series is an online public conversation and lecture series, as well as a digital residency and a program featuring artists, professionals, and researchers from a variety of disciplines. The events range from formal lectures to informal participatory conversations that encourage exchange in a peer-to-peer learning environment. Lost and Found Agency is a response to the unprecedented social and economic impacts the global pandemic has had on artists and also on arts professionals. It is also a mode of dealing with Fogo Island Arts remoteness in an era of re-evaluating the impact of travel. This platform for discussion and engagement presents an opportunity to support participants practicing in a range of locations by offering fees, strengthening their capacity to build networks, and intended to increase the exposure of their works and ideas. But before I introduce Min, I wanted to let Sarah talk a bit about Art Metropole.
Thanks, Michaela. I'm Sarah Maston. I am here on behalf of Art Metropole, and we're delighted to be a part of this project in conjunction with Fogo Island Arts. For anyone unfamiliar with Art Metropole, we are a not-for-profit artist-run center. We operate as a distributor of artist books, artist multiples, and artist editions. And our organization operates out of Toronto since the 1970s. Toronto is a traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is home to many diverse First Nation and Inuit and Métis people. So from Toronto, we'd like to recognize over 12,000 years of Indigenous activity and stewardship of the land.
Thanks, Sarah. So Schools of Thought is the inaugural presentation in the Lost and Found Agency online talk series. And as you will know by now, it's presented partnership with Art Metropole. Minh Nguyen is a writer, editor, and curator who focuses on decentered histories of conceptual, pedagogical, and cinematic arts, the communist imaginary and the avant-garde, uses of emergent technology as theme and material, and critical area studies of Asia. Currently Arts Associate Editor at Pioneer Works, Nguyen's writing has appeared in Art in America, AQNB, Frieze, MoMA's, Art Asia Pacific, and others. Formerly curatorial assistant for Conversations at the Edge, an experimental media program series at Gene Siskel Film Center, and exhibit specialist at Wing Luke Museum. Minh has also organized exhibitions and programs at Chicago Cultural Center, Northwest Film Forum, King Street Station, and Soil Gallery. Minh holds an MA in Modern and Contemporary Art History from the School of Art Institute of Chicago. And then without further ado, I'll pass it over to Minh.
Thank you, Michaela, for the introduction, and thank you everybody for joining me today on Zoom. We're going to upload the video with captions later. There are Zoom auto-generated captions, but they're usually terrible, and I feel like they're going to be really terrible for this, particularly with the language differences and the art terms. So we'll also upload the captions with the video later, so you can follow along if you'd like to review it again or for the first time. I'm excited to share some work that I have. The verb that describes it best is circling through for the past few years. I came to the School of the Art Institute of Chicago for graduate studies to study with Jennifer Dorothy Lee, who focuses on post-socialism, socialist aesthetic education, and Mao's legacy in China. Aside from being a dear mentor and friend, I learned to draw cross-national connections between socialist legacies through Dr. Lee. This research that I'm presenting, I feel very much in the middle of. Looking back at these works from 3 or even 1 year ago, I can see the ways that I'm pivoting my arguments or attempting to make different ones now. So it's very much, I'm hoping, you'll see an informal explosion of a notebook of thoughts. This invitation from Fogo Island Arts also comes at an opportune time because I will be participating in a seminar through Asia Art Archive on art schools in Asia particularly. So with this next year, through that seminar and through the residency with Fogo, I'm hoping to hone these ideas even more. For this presentation, I'm going to move in a windy order. It didn't make much sense to move chronologically. So I'm going to start first with some recent Vietnamese history and then move back in time and around geographically, and then end in the present. This photo is taken by my dad of Saigon about 2 years ago. So in the past 30 years, Vietnam has undergone drastic transformation. Its miracle growth is spurred by actions such as the 1986 Đổi Mới economic reforms, which literally means renovations, that changed it from a command economy to a market economy. In 1989, the country opened to ASEAN, Japan, and the European Union, as well as severed relations with the Soviet Union in 1991. In 1994, the United States lifted trade embargoes that allowed Western capital to enter Vietnam and established diplomatic ties a year later. A bilateral trade agreement with the US was established in 2000, which was followed by the IMF and the World Bank privatizing Vietnam's state-owned enterprises. In 2007, the country entered the World Trade Organization, and from 2000 to 2009, the public sector went from employing 60% to 20% of the population. And the workforce underwent a process of equitization, or transferring public assets into the private sector. This abrupt growth results in a tension that you can feel in the country, but also see in the landscape. Billboards for companies such as LG Electronics or Pepsi are erected alongside government signs that feature the Democratic Republic of Vietnam's flag, the hammered sickle symbol, and the phrase, which translates to "do as the uncle says," imagery of Ho Chi Minh, other signs that read "propel the country's industrialization and modernization." It's from this scenario and observation that I first arrived at the term post-socialism a few years ago, which I've come to find out is an intensely contentious term in the academy. There are decades-long quarrels, 7 different definitions, but I'm going to highlight some of them that I find useful and sort of applicable to both Vietnam and the kind of cross-national analysis that I'm interested in making, particularly with post-socialist countries or regions in Asia. So in an article called "Is the Post in Post-Socialism, the Post in Post-Humanism?" Shi Shumei in 2012 writes that at first sight, post-socialism appears to apply only to either the former socialist countries, the Eastern Bloc and the Soviet Union, or the actually existing socialist countries that have hybridized their economies, China and Vietnam. Not to the continuous socialist or newly socialist countries, and never to the capitalist countries in different parts of the world, especially Western Europe and the United States. So according to Shi, post-socialism's apparent inapplicability to the West is a major reason for the lack of interest in American academia and is confined to area studies, which I find true. I think you would find these terms in East Asian studies, primarily, under the assumption that it lacks universal significance. Shi writes that this is despite the fact that post-socialism, even in the narrow sense used above, affects more than 30% of the world's landmass and more than 50% of the human population. In a broader sense, then, post-socialism ought to be considered as a condition affecting the entire world. The collapse of the Soviet Empire and the end of the Cold War reconfigure the world in specific ways. For instance, the Cold War divided the world around a particular kind of dichotomy of East and West, socialism and capitalism, not the East and West of Orientalism and Occidentalism. So in this article, the post-humanism part that Shi is referring to, Shi locates the emergence of post-socialism, specifically with the decline of Marxist humanism, which was a crucial thread running through many social movements in the global 1960s, as a viable alternative to totalitarian socialism and the neoliberal humanism of the market. Quoting Shi again, we can also view Marxist humanism as a theoretical intervention in the dogmatic Marxism of communist states. And as such, it was a potential that was not realized prior to many of these communist states post-Cold War and post-socialist onward march toward market economy and neoliberalization, which instituted the liberal humanism of the market as the implicit standard. Another scholar, Aaron Y. Huang, who recently published a book called Urban Horror, Neoliberal Post-Socialism and the Limits of Visibility, builds on Shi's idea by expanding on post-socialism as both an affective state, like a psychic emotional state, and a condition that impacts not only formalist socialist regions, but more of as a symbol of global capitalism. She writes that rather than marking the end of socialism, what the post signifier encapsulates in a global system without a proper name, where neoliberal ideology reigns alongside authoritarian state control. The condition is built upon a mode of regression, where the future is conceptualized through indeterminable relations with a former system that is neither alive or dead. Rather than describing a new era to come, the post conjoins a suspended future with a reimagined past. So one of the chapters in her book, she applies it to Hong Kong, which is very contentious because people will argue that Hong Kong was never a socialist state, so it technically can't be post-socialist. But in trying to make this argument that it's a condition that affects, a condition that's a symbol for global capitalism that affects places that didn't necessarily have a socialist past, one of the images she presents is during the umbrella movement protests, where you can see plumes of tear gas smoke in the air in front of skyscrapers with the socialist slogan, "Prosperous nation comes from wealthy families," lit up in red. So of course, though the regions are different, this framework of freedom to mean free market economy and governmentality as the expansion of the socialist state, but proposes an iteration of post-socialism that is shaped by liberal market forces, is what I find applicable to Vietnam, where there's booming economic growth, rapid expansion, and upward mobility, but still an obliquely authoritarian government, lack of free press, a one-party government, and that exercises its powers through arbitrarily defined yet fierce regulations on free speech via the Ministry of Culture, Sports, and Tourism, which evolved from the Department of Propaganda. This situation perpetuates a false consciousness of freedom through consumption and economic mobility, while civil rights, free speech, and the public sphere remain constricted. Within the arts, speaking of the constrictedness, all programs must apply for an official exhibition permit from the Ministry of Culture, Sports, and Tourism. The multi-tiered application must include background information about each participant, who are then subjected to initial approval review by both the ministry board and later interrogation by ministry workers. It still happens all the time. Spaces are raided, filmmakers and artists are arrested or their works are confiscated, sometimes without explanation. Bribery is rampant, disorganization is rampant. And then the last framework of post-socialism that I've been thinking about a lot is in sort of an aesthetic one, in the same way that people might use post-conceptual to mean that it references signifiers from conceptualism, as in post-socialism references signifiers from socialism, but is removed from its context, like as in they're empty. So I think that within the places, it could look something like what China has as cynical realism, where there are appropriations of like paintings of Mao or like figurative styles. And I think diasporically, it can look like references of socialist art or socialist realism. So I think a really good example of this aesthetic is the Propeller Group's television commercial for communism, which is a single channel video with sound that's a minute, but was also installed as an installation. So the Propeller Group worked with TBWA Vietnam, who is an advertising agency who made the local Apple commercial to sort of make a commercial for communism, including things like the brainstorming sessions, storyboard images, animatics that they've then kind of installed as this display of how you would go about designing a brand strategy. And to sort of make, in my opinion, kind of like cynical comparisons between state propaganda and advertising that I think harken to like a Clement Greenberg kind of critique. But so yeah, like given this landscape and given this liberal use of the signifiers of the politicization of aesthetics, I was compelled to go back and think about what socialist art was meant to be in the first place. So from the issue of art to the issue of position is a reference to Liu Ding and Carol Yinghua Liu series on eFlux in 2014 called The Echoes of Socialist Realism. I really like the phrase because I think it's a really good way to put the politicization of aesthetic theory that occurs during revolutionary times. So to sort of go back to basics, I think maybe some people are familiar with like the Soviet Union socialist realism movement as starting in the 1930s at the first convention of Soviet artists with like Boris Egoinsin, Maxim Gorsky, to sort of devise a socialist realism strategy in a style that the dictum was obviously socialist in form, but realist in style. And I think this gets misinterpreted a lot, including by the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, which I'll talk about later, but it wasn't supposed to depict reality in the realist sense, but it was supposed to presuppose historical development and class struggle so as to lay claim to a place in the realm of realism. So they saw intellectuals, writers, and artists entrusted with the duty of changing and educating the working class to accept communist utopia as the ultimate truth, as well as the inevitability of the revolution. So to move to like Vietnam's takeover of this in 1945, the Viet Minh defeated the French troops, and along the complete reconstruction period, the DRVN, the Democratic Republic, began their overhaul of cultural production that reoriented artists and writers as public messengers of the national agenda. So influenced by Lenin's rhetoric of unity in party organization and party literature, Ho Chi Minh implored Vietnamese people to consider in all their endeavors one for all. And his speeches at the time also reflected Maoism, particularly Mao's famous Yan'an talks of literature and art in May 1942, a couple years before, which rationalized the service of literature and art to politics in order to achieve liberation from Western occupation. So modernism had already come to Saigon through the Beaux Arts, and at a visit to an exhibition at the Cultural Association for National Salvation in 45, Ho Chi Minh proclaimed, "All these paintings are very beautiful, but these are upper class beauties. Why don't you make paintings about lower class beauties around us?" And then the General Secretary of the DRVN, Trung Dinh, at the National Cultural Conference in 48, delivered a Marxism and Vietnamese culture paper, where he announced that art and literature must achieve three objectives: national, technical, and popular, and prescribes socialist realism as a portrayal of truth according to objective laws. He denounced that Western modernism, and which he clumped Cubism, Impressionism, Surrealism, and Dadaism together, that it sprouted from the rotten wood of imperialist culture. And then 2 years later, he would create the Propaganda Poster Bureau in the Department of Information and Propaganda. And there's a really great archive of socialist realist materials in Saigon called the Dogma Collection. It's a private collection. But yeah, there are some really great posters there. I think this one says, and Vietnamese people in the room can correct me, but I think it's like on time collective work, but they're really beautiful. And so just like Xu Mei was saying, like these periods are dogmatic in their own ways. And I think when talking about this, I am careful because I'm not exactly making like an apologia for the authoritarianism, but I do think that the art that's coming out right now, or certain understandings of art and aesthetics under state communism that references this period, can perpetuate some of these dichotomies of freedom versus propaganda, abstract versus figurative, that I think I used to sort of get stuck into, but lately I'm kind of wondering if they're dead ends. Not to mention, I think that sometimes there's a conflation between state communism and the communist imaginary. So I also sort of wanted to return to the source. And this is, of course, the super famous quote from Economic and Philosophic Manuscript. I didn't feel right excerpting it, but I won't read the whole thing. I think I'm going to start here. I have to move my little box. Each of his human relations to the world, seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, feeling, thinking, observing, experiencing, wanting, acting, loving. In short, all the organs of his individual being, like those organs which are directly social in their form, are in their objective orientation, or in their orientation to the object, the appropriation of the object, the appropriation of human reality. The abolition of private property is therefore the complete emancipation of all human senses and qualities. But it is this emancipation precisely because these senses and attributes have become subjectively and objectively human. The eye has become a human eye, just as its object has become a social human object, an object made by man for man. The senses have therefore become directly in their practice theoritions. So this is what the humanism that Xu is referring to. And art historians like John Roberts have argued that state communism's conservative foreclosure of the senses, of what sort of people associate with socialist art as sort of like the crude figurative works, have produced the opposite of what Marx imagined as the re-aestheticization of experience under communist social relations. Through the destruction of bourgeois culture, the senses, he believed, would be released from the tyranny of reified social forms. And communism for Marx is precisely the production and collective exchange of singularities, and as such represents a collective aesthetic transformation of social form and the senses. And in this sense, the release of new social forms from within, in opposition to bourgeois culture, should be understood as a radical transformation of the relational content of the senses. And I think if you're familiar with this, you know that this conception of the senses is very Kantian, which, as far as I understand, was an indirect influence to Ho Chi Minh, maybe direct, but was a very direct influence to intellectuals in the new culture movement that eventually led to Maoism. Who were also influenced by Schiller and John Dewey. So Tsai Wan-pei, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, who was the education minister of the newly established Chinese Republic in 1912, during the last years of the Qin dynasty and the early Republic era, officially committed to aesthetic education in policy. So in his speech, where he was trying to articulate the policy of this called On Replacing Religion with Aesthetic Education, he elaborates on the ideas of the spiritual functions of knowledge by saying, if knowledge and will are divorced from religion, of the three functions with the closest relationship to religion, only emotion or aesthetic feeling remains. So he advocated for like a universality of beauty. He really latched onto the idea of beauty, which obviously is kind of contested, but it seems like what he meant by that was like heightened sensorial experience in the Dewey sense. But so if beauty is universal, there cannot exist the consciousness of ourselves as differentiated from others. So Mao would reinterpret these writings towards a Marxist narrative, and also borrowing from Lenin's notion of socialist consciousness about unity of consciousness through artistic expression. And I think I mentioned, but Ho Chi Minh was also obviously inspired by Lenin. So during the Yan'an talks, Mao says, no revolutionary artist can do any meaningful work unless he's closely linked with the masses, gives expressions to their thoughts and feelings, and serves them as a loyal spokesman. That literature and art operate as part of a revolutionary machine, and fighting the enemy would require one heart and one mind. So this is kind of an aside, but I just want to show this because it's so nice. But Mao was an avid Soviet-style ballroom dancer, and the ballroom dances were often organized by his wife. And other than the fact that I think that's kind of a funny historical fact, I think I also wanted to show it because I think when people think of socialist art and they think of socialist realism as being the paintings, people don't think of it as necessarily like a performance dance and like movement-based thing. But a lot of it was like this lotus dance. The dances that he choreographed, I think, get at more of the philosophy that he was trying to articulate of people moving, like to him, being presupposes consciousness. So of people like moving first and then feeling like a socialist consciousness after, of moving in sync with people, being a part of like a socialist form, and then also spectating it, like also being a spectator. Like there's the action and the looking at it that was very important to him. And these were staged for both locals and also staged as sort of spectacles for other people to sort of demonstrate and show how, like, what a beautiful collective experience socialism can be. And I also wanted to show these from Vo Han Kan, who was a photographer who traveled with the guerrilla unit in the 1960s and 70s to document the front line of the Vietnamese resistance against the US. He managed the photography department of the local revolutionary cause and documented events related to music and dance. And he would stage photographic exhibitions in the mangrove forest. So they would all be training there, and then they would set up these exhibitions of photographs. And he, did someone say, wow, I think someone mentioned this exhibition right before I said it. Amazing. Sorry. Well, what I love about these photographs is how ambiguous they are. Like all the borders you would imagine sort of between like work and play, rehearsal, or the actual thing, inside and outside in some parts, because they like made makeshift rooms for studying and rehearsing, and like enacted all these plays too. And also these captions, I believe. So San Art, which is a really great contemporary art space in Saigon, worked with him to stage this retrospective show a year ago. And I believe that they wrote these captions with him. But like, I also love like the affective ambiguity of it, because like they're all clearly having a good time. And I think it sort of countervails this notion of sort of like brainwashed authoritarianism that sometimes we think of with socialist aesthetic movements. So art historians like John Roberts, who I already mentioned, and Chang Tan have written on the communist imaginary's influence on avant-garde art and relational aesthetics. In the influence of their condemnation of bourgeois social relations and their interests in reconnecting artistic creativity within everyday life. So in Chang Tan's article, Art for of the Masses, attempts to grasp with the radical heritage of, in Chang Tan's article, Art for of the Masses, attempts to grasp with the radical heritage of communism on social relations and art, particularly Chinese communism, which is trying to reclaim it from the PRC. So Tan writes, the communist heritage has many layers. Its utopian vision has invariably turned into totalitarian nightmares, but its initial momentum was undeniably transformative, and its ideals as both guerrilla radicalism and the milder version of liberal socialism continue to provide ideological support for those facing the real or imagined threat of imperialism and predatory capitalism. So I think that Tan is responding directly to an article that John Roberts wrote, in which he draws the connections between relational aesthetic, Nicholas Baudrillard's book, and the New Left movement of the 60s or 80s, and is making like a broader claim that most relational or social practice art is indebted to the communist imaginary. And I think Tan agrees, but is sort of adding specificity by saying that while it is true and like these relational aesthetics look similar, what's happening in China or in places where there was a socialist history is different and like kind of non-comparable. So Tan says, some artists search this heritage for an alternative methodology, an alternative to the institutionalized art world of today, in production as well as in display. This methodology focuses on exploring the communal aspect of art to connect art with citizens who are normally excluded from the consumption of luxury cultural goods, to experiment with a collective mode of production that eschews the cult of individual authorship, and to create, no matter how fleetingly, an aesthetic utopia where the joy of discovery, expression, and creativity is integrated with everyday life. This community building apparently shares the agenda of relational art, but the communist legacy it draws from is distinctly Chinese, with the Maoist slogan, Art for the Masses, as its ostensible goal. So what they call communal aesthetics, in different words, is a wide-ranging and mass-oriented outreach of knowing the signifiers that would reach everyday people, mutually stimulating relationships between artists and the audience, and a collective working mode that reduces the role of individual authorship. And also the creation and revisiting of shared knowledge and memories. So this legacy, which Tan also calls the Red Legacy, is the way that the Cultural Revolution developed a formulaic visual vocabulary that renders the subject matter immediately comprehensible and relatable to working people. So some projects that Tan cites in the article are Su Bing's A Consideration of Golden Apples from 2002, which consists of the artist giving away 3 tons of apples to the working people of Beijing, a simple act of kindness that appropriates the concept of socialist consideration and compassion embedded in the collective memory of a whole generation of Chinese people. So I, inspired by this reading of communal aesthetics, especially the part about revisiting memories that only people who grew up with socialist legacies can, I've been thinking a lot about Zhang Min-duk's work, which is the title slide or the picture on all the promo images. This performance from a show at the Factory Contemporary Arts Center in 2019 is called Dim Sao Counting Stars, and it's a choreographed performance, or a performance that the artist choreographed by inviting young dancers who are part of this Bupsanghang Pink Lotus Festival that children train in, that has a history from the Counting Star song has a history from the 50s of being a socialist song, albeit in the South. And he brought it to the factory and had them perform it here. So in a conversation with Duke recently, he told me that when he was 9, he was selected for a choir as a student in a socialist school system. In his words, he says, "My work focuses on the belief of a person that is born from a socialist country, with all the personal, familial memories, but also an ideological concept transferred to Vietnam from Russia and China. People know the big side, the big history, but there are the little things that I know, the little happier stories that I would share." When the Counting Star song is performed, it lights up a memory that is inside already, how it's like growing up as a socialist teenager, the transformation of the belief. Duke also points out that the star is a common symbol of belief in Vietnam, whereas in Russia, it's more of the sun, and also interprets this song as when it's transferred into a song, the star becomes a wish. So as I mentioned, Duke contacted the performers and brought them to the factory, but he tells me that it divorced from the usual staging of the performance, like it's on this elaborate setup where you'll see later when I change slides, there's an elaborate backdrop and music. It looks a little divorced from it, and he says was even like a little creepy when they would come out in the dark with the lit lamps. But if you knew, you knew, like if you recognized them from your childhood, you knew exactly what you were about to see. So I imagined it created a sort of like selective memory for certain people who were there. And it reminded me of something that Chang Tan wrote about communal aesthetics, that unlike most relational art, communal art can never sever itself from its points of origin without losing its visual and experiential impact, and therefore cannot be reproduced and re-performed when being exhibited in institutional settings. These experiences created are often too interactive and personal to be captured even on video. Unlike performance art, they also lack a strong focal point that can be photographed in a way that conveys visual or sensual power. Even being there does not guarantee you participation. One has to come with a set of shared knowledge, memories, and experiences that are particular to our community. This performance was paired at the factory with another piece that he did called Singing in Pink. That was a collage of found photographs from these types of performances. And I was at this show and I wish I took better pictures because some of them are really incredible. I just have these. And he didn't have that many either, but like the staging of them are really elaborate. Like I wish I had the ones where you could see Ho Chi Minh's like effigy just sort of floating in the air like a god. But there's something very interesting about this sort of being like a child's extracurricular activity that you could see anywhere else, you know, dancing, singing, learning to choreograph those movements with but with this kind of like casual socialist backdrop. And he also paired it with this installation called We're Happy to Learn to Be Stars of educational publications that he had also sourced from online and I believe through the community. Here's my picture of it. But these books also are something that a lot of Vietnamese children have exposure to, also kind of thread the line of being extremely universal, I guess, educational materials of like how to collaborate with others, how to have social skills, but also with this backdrop of socialism. For example, like this one is how to tie a red scarf. And so you kind of go through the motions, you know, you're like, pull that, not that, step 4, and then be like, and then salute Uncle Ho. So when I first came upon this work in 2019, I think I too was sort of thinking in the dichotomies that I was talking about of sort of conceptualizing contemporary art in Vietnam, that is art since the renovation period, as signifying a break from socialist history. And it's kind of how it's written about in art history. So curators have coined like signature Đổi Mới style as testifying to the sustained energy around counterfigurative works in the midst of state communism. There is a landmark exhibition called Abstract Painting in Saigon in 1992 that is regarded as the first official national exhibition of abstract painting to be held after the renovation period, that signified a disavowal of state-defined socialist art. Though art historians also note that when this exhibition came out, it even seemed conservative to the younger generation who weren't interested in expressing abstraction through the canvas anymore. And in a catalog for the exhibition, Uncorked Soul, which I think is like such gross imagery, but the first outside exhibition of contemporary Vietnamese art to be held in Hong Kong in 1991, the catalog quotes an artist who declares that thanks to the collapse of state socialism, quote, originality and diversity had begun to replace the monotony of the collective. In an article called Đổi Mới and the Globalization of Vietnamese Art, Nora Taylor and Pamela Corey write that in the early 90s, it was as if all writing on art centered on this image, the allegory of the once repressed and now suddenly free, liberated, and liberal Vietnam. So yeah, this break is very instantiated in like the art historical materials too. But I think that Duc's work is, and other works that are coming out right now, is sort of helping me think through this art history in the same way that Cheng Tan is thinking through Chinese art history, of sort of recuperating the socialist imaginary away from the state and sort of the legacies of what it leaves behind. Which brings me to a more positive framework of post-socialism by a prominent Chinese scholar named Arif Derlich, who writes that I would suggest that post-socialism, rather than signaling the end of socialism, offers the possibility in the midst of a crisis in socialism of rethinking it in new, more creative ways. My use of it here is intended to suggest that radical visions of the future must move beyond what we have understood over the last century by the concepts that we've been given. So yeah, I think that's like the more thought through parts. And I guess I just wanted to end it by showing you like some other work that I'm really loving right now and some other ideas and directions that I would like to think through. So this is by Trung Công Tung, called Magical Garden, which is also a series of found photographs from the Magical Garden in the Long An province, which is based around the phenomena that the superstition that the garden has healing properties for the sick who visit and bathe in the waters there. And I'm interested in sort of thinking through belief in the sense that Duc was showing us, as, or in the socialist sense of like, how do you harness like a collective belief and desire in people and thinking of like the through line of belief in the extremely long history of supernaturalism in Vietnam too, and thinking of like, can you sort of make connections between, like, is there sort of a connection between like the collectivism required and like the beliefs there, and like how does it change people and propel people to act differently? And also I feel compelled by the concept of belief right now, because I think to also countervail the idea that conceptualism was something that was like just introduced after the renovation period, I feel like it's sort of like conceding to the idea that once Vietnam opened up internationally, only did people have the idea to make conceptual work, when I sort of want to argue that belief is sort of conceptual on its own, or the ways that people were working with things that they couldn't see in front of them was also them working with conceptualism. Well, that's all I have. I hope that wasn't terribly long.
No, I think that was perfect.
Brilliant, thank you. So I know that, I think we all know that those presentations, because you don't get a direct feedback from people, are always a little bit hard, but it's fantastic. Thank you very much.
We wanted to open up, I guess, the metaphorical floor of sorts to people who were interested in asking questions or had anything, questions, queries. Doesn't have to be a question necessarily. It can be sort of a more general thought. So yeah, please don't hesitate to ask and unmute yourself. Or if you can't unmute yourself, write it in the chat and I can read it out loud.
I welcome thoughts too. You don't even have to ask me a question.
And then I just wanted to ask you, sorry, I'm going to mispronounce his name, but Duc's work, what generation is he from, like, of artist? Is he like 80s? Born in the 80s, or? Yeah, the cover image.
This artist is like 35. So he's very contemporary, and the cover image artist, he's like 38. So they're both pretty contemporary.
Yeah, so born in the 70s, late 70s, early 80s, maybe.
And they're both born in the 80s.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Oh, we have a hand.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
So we've heard you present for the past hour, and I'm really interested to know what research you are doing at the moment.
Yeah, like I mentioned, I'm reading a lot of writings on conceptual art right now and trying to think about alternative perspectives of the way conceptual art has been historicized.
Does it have a tendency that focuses on Vietnam in particular, or just in general, cross-national, as you've said?
Kind of both. I think in the US, and as a critic and curator, I look at a lot of different kinds of work, but I'm interested in looping it back to Vietnam too.
Thank you.
One of the things I thought was really compelling is sort of like a look back onto people, and maybe we can call them like an affected population, then as like a membrane almost of of history, which obviously I think they are, but it reminded me a lot of, and this is sort of a more general comment, I guess, of thinking about, you know, the philosophers that talk about ideology being like interpolating the subject into being, but then thinking about it a bit more through belief and religion and different systems of belief more generally, and the relationship there, which I think is interesting, especially when you talk about being and existing in 3D, which I think these works tend to also reflect in a really interesting way.
Yeah, Am I muted? No. Yeah, and I mentioned that that's in the Maoist text too. Like there's a lot of philosophy about being presupposing consciousness. And there is like the metaphysical aspect that I feel like they also got from Kant of like enacting it first and then looking back at the enactment of it. You know, it's sort of like the belief thing. And I think belief and ideology are like very, very murky to talk about in any like concrete way, but that wasn't a lot of the philosophical text too.
Yeah.
Any art historians have comments?
I think the artist is also has joined on occasion and left, and now I think is joined again. Don't want to put him on the spot though.
And then I was just kind of curious, since you showed a lot of like historical source images from well, the Chinese context, I just wondered if you're looking at this within contemporary Chinese artists as well, how this is related to their practice. Just curious.
I've looked at some of it, but there's so much of it that I don't feel like I have like the authority to really comment on it because it's like so complex. But in just the few examples that I shared in this talk, I think when I was doing the comparative readings of revolutionary texts with my advisor, we were sort of really scrutinizing the Yan'an talks, and we were looking at some contemporary examples. I was really into Cao Fei, who you might know made, like there's a lot of Chinese contemporary art that is really heavily referencing pop culture, like Xiao Bandi, also might be mispronouncing, but he did the whole series of like the pandas, and Cao Fei made the video of the cosplayers. Like there's a lot of references to pop culture and just sort of like very low common denominator, like visual pleasures that they're working in, that I think some Chinese scholars would also say is like building off this art for the masses legacy. But you know, I don't think I could say something like that authoritatively, just not speaking Chinese.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think Zhu Bing, who I mentioned, did the apples piece. Also, like there are some artists, I believe he's older, and like there are some artists who experienced the Cultural Revolution, so who can sort of speak to it. And I believe he also was saying that like they're sort of arguing that the Maoist period of art is more avant-garde than people would give it credit for. And like having lived through it personally, there was sort of an influx of creative experimentation that people wouldn't necessarily associate with it.
And sort of a more general question about the future of your research. So you're going to go on to do a seminar series in October, and is your hope to sort of publish like a body of work on this material, or like do you have any, not trying to, you know, I guess oversubscribe you to something you're not trying to subscribe to, but I'm just sort of curious about like what your maybe ambitions are.
Well, I'm working on that monograph with you guys, and so that I think I will finish in next year, at the end of next year. So it's well timed because I think the seminar will help me work on these ideas with scholars who are working in Asia, and then the final output will be a book with Art Metropole. And I think it will definitely be related to these ideas. I think there will be different essays. So my thesis, which I didn't really get into, which is like another thing I've been working on, but right now I feel like sort of done with that. It was looking at the development of dialogic studio art practices in Vietnam through contemporary art spaces. And what I mean by that is like talk-based critique of basically like the idea of art schooling as just being, you know, if you've ever gone to an art school, it's just like 3 hours where you sit there and then you're kind of like volleying ideas. Like the idea is like, it's like based in idea art, or which is also like conceptual, like you don't learn a technical skill per se, but you sort of learn to talk about the work. And so I was looking at the relationship between language and conceptual art, and also the incidental impact of it in a place where there's censorship. And other people have written about this, although not as explicitly in art history, but like the incidental ways that conceptual art is wielded in places where there's censorship, because you can't really censor ideas. And I think I mentioned this, a line of this in my description of the event, if you're like wondering where that part went, but yeah, so that's another essay that will probably go in there.
Yeah, for those, I guess, briefly who don't know, Min is a recipient of the Islands Residency, which is a partnership with Art Metropole and Fogo Island Arts. And that residency is in particular like an arts writing residency, I would say. And so recipients of that residency program come to Fogo Island for a month and then go to Toronto and stay on Toronto Island for 2 weeks with Artscape Gibraltar Point. But anyway, the conclusion of the residency is essentially a book published by Art Metropole, which is really exciting. One of the most recent recipients, I think, has a forthcoming book, is Nora Khan, whose book is being published by Art Metropole, I think in a few months actually, which will be really interesting, and I would tell you to keep an eye out for. Someone in the comments has a question, so I'll just say it out loud. Where does the contemporary socialist imaginary of Vietnam connect internationally? And then the follow-up, which I'll read, is just curious if you feel there are commons we can look at, because I felt like when you were talking about the more recent practices that they were working from a position that could accommodate American conceptual art in the 70s. And I also wonder where these practices are inherited to date too.
Hi, Jason. Okay, I think I talked about this. Well, I think I talked about this, but I think even before graduate school was really interested in forming an analysis of the socialist and post-socialist imaginary in art, like specifically across Vietnam and China. And this isn't really, like, this is very seldom done because of weird area studies divisions. Like it's East Asia versus Southeast Asia, and you just like can't get away from that. But I went to my advisor because she sort of permitted me to do that because she had a course on post-socialism. So I think like some of the connections that I was making was both both of the revolutionaries in Vietnam and China's being influenced by like the aesthetic theory of Marxism and Kantianism that like perhaps at least in the DRVN they weren't making explicitly, but that resulted in these doctrines of socialist in content, realist in form, that then sort of got bastardized later. And I'm sorry, what is the second part of your question? American conceptual art in the 70s. So I'm kind of like working through this now, but I like don't feel confident about it because I've been revisiting that Blake Stimson conceptual art reader, and also recently had a chance to read the Global Conceptualism book that was written by, or from the landmark exhibition by Louise Chemnitzer, who I also love. But if you're not affiliated with an institution and you're in New York, it's at Asia Art Archive. which you can go visit because it's a very hard reader to find. I think you can buy it online for like hundreds of dollars. But so that exhibition, like I might have it in my notes. So like that exhibition was historical because they were trying to argue that unlike the canonization of American conceptual art, which was like related to minimalism and started with solo wit and that guy whose name I can't remember with the chairs, it like in other contexts, like in context of like in Latin America, where it was lined up with the pedagogical movements and lined up with like Freire and other sorts of autonomous movements in just social liberation, and also in places where there is censorship. It has different kinds of histories and was created for different sorts of reasons and emerged out of different desires to merge art and life that aren't related to critiquing the art system, which some American conceptual art is. But people in here definitely know about that more than me, so feel free to jump in.
We also have another hand up, but I'm okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I was interested in the earlier comment that Minh said about how censorship in Vietnam cannot manipulate, cannot censor, how Vietnam cannot censor idea, or similarly how idea is something that is not grounded in reality, so therefore very hard to touch. But as a regular art enthusiast in Vietnam, I feel that idea is the most regulated field, not in just aesthetics culture, but in society as a whole, even though it is something that is above the ground. As you may know, Marx says that these ideas are materialized in reality, and through these images, these symbols, even just symbols or representations, even just the slightest implications, the authority can still find one way or another to say, okay, so I imply that there's something wrong in this image. The idea is wrong. The idea is provocative. You have to take it down. So that's how I feel about the current situation in Vietnam regarding the censorship in arts and culture. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm so glad you're here joining us and offered that perspective. And you're right. It's a weird, convoluted situation, like from my research, and feel free to offer like your on the ground experience too. But so Zoe Butt, who is a curator there, who's worked on exhibitions there for a long period of time, has written about this, where because she used to curate a space, older sand art, and then moved to the factory, but I believe there was so much bullying and like pressure from the government, where they would come in, not explain why, but just confiscate works, remove works, or say like this doesn't pass code. They would like loiter around the buildings, and I think eventually that one of the spaces was shut down. And then they relocated to a new space. But she's written about this in an essay called Red Tape and Digital Talismans. But so one of the ways that more interpretive art, I guess I should say, over ideas art, because you're right, they are like extremely censoring of ideas, but like I guess the difference between like plain free speech, where if you're a journalist and you're like, the police are eradicating farmland again, or they're, evicting farmers, like you're going to, the thing that you produce, you're going to get arrested for that. But if you make a conceptual work that like has elements of that you can sort of bring out in closed spaces, like at an exhibition opening, where it only sort of alludes to that, you know, it's like the color of the wheat or like some other references to that. You can write it differently in the press release as being an exploration of these themes, and you can explain it differently. So I think that kind of accordion-like nature of like the interpretation of it based on who is present is sort of what I mean by it being more like useful if you're trying to use it as like a maneuver to weave through censorship. Like it sort of becomes a tactic.
Yeah, that's interesting when you mentioned the press release and communications related stuff. That's when I think it's appropriate that you mentioned language come into play. Yeah.
So in that essay, she wrote that for an exhibition, she wrote 4 different press releases. And like there's the Vietnamese one. And the other dynamic is a lot of the bureaucrats who like censor the art. I don't really understand like the chain of command, but I've seen them. A lot of them may not speak English. So like the Vietnamese text is going to be written one way. The English, I've seen this firsthand too. Like I feel like when they announce shows, you know, if it's announced on like a local Vietnamese paper, it's also going to be written another way in the Vietnamese and in the English. And then if it's written on, I don't know, if it's for like an efflux announcement or something that local bureaucrats like wouldn't know to check, then it's going to be written another way. Or when they're talking to critics who are writing for something bigger or more international, like art review or whatever like that, then they can be like more forthright. And you've seen this with like a lot of works that have been shown in Vietnam.
Yeah, totally.
And then I was just curious if you've looked at all at some of the US kind of campaign of sending Martha Graham and Alvin Ailey and some of the kind of modernist dancers to Southeast Asia during the Cold War period. I just thought it might be interesting to look at some of those connections with performance and dance in your research.
I'm sorry, can you say those names again, or can you type them in the chat?
Yeah, sure, I'll send you a link. It's Alvin Ailey and Martha Graham.
It doesn't ring a bell to me.
I'll send you a link because it might be interesting to just look into if there are any connections.
Thank you. Yeah, back to the censorship thing. It's funny because I think I have finished the essay on like the phenomenon that I was talking about of like language maneuvers. And I kind of thought it would be more expanded, but I think I'm kind of done with it. I feel like there's a certain amount of focus that you need to put to it. And then today on Facebook, a Vietnamese filmmaker just published something. He was like, I'm so sick of people focusing on censorship in Vietnamese art. Is that all, you know, like, do people feel bad for us because it can't, like, we're so censored? Is that the only reason why you like think it's worth looking at our work in the first place? And I think I was like in agreement with that. And I was like, I think this only needs to be so much dedication to it before looking at like the works itself and like the merits of them on their own right.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's an interesting sort of point as well, especially when it comes to like systems of language or like systems of grammar as being things that can be like really malleable and really like vernacularized, I think, in a sense, is a word that I just invented. But I'm mindful of the time, but I wanted to sort of make sure that everyone has had a chance to ask a question or say what they wanted to say before we wrap up. Okay, great.
I'll show you one more. There's one more.
Yeah. Oh, amazing. Well, I wanted to say thank you so much, Min, for agreeing to, and doing this talk with us. It's been really amazing. I think even ahead of you coming to Fogo Island and being in sort of like a limbo for the past, I don't know, I want to say like 2 years, maybe less. It's just nice. Yeah, it's nice to sort of get a sense of some of the work that you do, and we can look, and as we look forward to you coming to the island and all the things that are ahead. So thank you so much. Thank you to everyone for coming. We are going to have Lost and Found will be a series that continues every single month. So watch this space. Please check out our Instagram. All those things. There'll be lots of updates about future talks and all those things. More details to come soon.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I was hoping someone would argue with me, but
Still time.
If you want to email me and argue, I would love it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. I'll end the meeting sort of shortly, but I'll wait until then so I don't kick people out. Okay, amazing. Okay, I'm gonna end it now, but thank you so much. It was really brilliant and super interesting.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it was really hard to talk for that long. I feel like when I started, I was like, my throat was like, here we go.